I'm gonna play catch-up for a moment, but I'll talk about movies soon enough. There are a few reasons for the recent inactivity on my channel. Last semester I was just way too busy with school, but I've posted my projects and linked to a few others I worked on. I don't feel bad for prioritizing school over YouTube, but after the semester ended I definitely had time to get active again, and the only video I made was one that wasn't even planned. It was more a fever dream than anything. The aftermath of the cats video, and a few of my more successful videos of the past year, got me thinking about my platform, and what warrants a video, and I guess I came to the conclusion that it's not enough to just review a movie anymore. I figured I had to have something novel to say to warrant a video, and I haven't really had anything novel to say in a while. It's not enough to just state my opinion on something for 8 minutes and log off, because who am I? Who asked for my opinion? And it doesn't cost you anything but your time to watch my videos, but I think having a Patreon as well has given me a sense of financial obligation that's kind of been freaking me out. Some people actually are paying me to do this, and I'm really grateful for that, so I don't want to make something that isn't worth their money. I think Letterboxd has something to do with it too, because there's a platform designated to post reviews for free, so when does my opinion of something become interesting enough to post on YouTube and make ad revenue off of it? The irony there is that I got so scared of making something not worth their money, I just didn't make anything at all, which is worth even less of their money. None, to be precise, and I don't blame anyone who unpledged. There's also irony in the fact that my channel became a lot more traditional review focused after I basically denounced video essays, and now I've come full circle to the point where I don't even want to record something that isn't important enough to be worked into an essay. I don't really know what next steps to take, but I think for a little while I'm gonna start putting out videos just for the sake of putting out videos, and see if anything good becomes of it. And the whole time I should have been uploading consistently again though, I have been working on a single video. And I don't mean working on it in the sense that months later it's a refined masterpiece. I mean working on it in the sense that I've tried 3 different approaches and none of them have been good enough to record, and all the various routes of discussion are still just as crude and unprocessed as ever. I wanted to look at Marriage Story as a theoretical sequel to The Squid and the Whale, in which Walt grows up and is still pretty pretentious but is a better person in his active attempt to not be his father. But then I figured it was probably a good idea to watch the rest of Noah Baumbach's movies, because it's not that Walt and Charlie are similar characters. They're just both Noah Baumbach self-inserts. The Meyerowitz brothers are too, to an extent, and as I watched through his filmography, it became apparent that there was already an established through line that Marriage Story continues effectively, but doesn't exactly redefine, so my thesis there would have been a little shaky, which is why I didn't make that video. As I watched more of his movies, I became obsessed with small images and actions that recur throughout his work, and that became the desired focus of my video. But I quickly realized that this was really just a series of observations more than anything, and doesn't illuminate much more about the through lines than just Baumbach's preferred images to externalize relationships, so that video went in the gutter. Then I tried to put Marriage Story in the context of other 2019 films that felt fittingly conclusive to close out the 2010s, but that one was really unfocused, and the only through line of all these unproduced videos was me trying to explain the through line of Baumbach's work, which I didn't think was very novel, so I kind of gave up for a little bit. I think I've thought about it to the point where I don't even know what novelty is anymore, or what it's worth. But there's been something about this discourse that I feel like I have to join in on. It's like a pain in my side that I can't get rid of by any means other than publicly talking about it. People focus on the divorce aspects of Baumbach's films because he's clearly been so affected by his own experience with divorce. But I think there's a whole other side to the through line that's just as essential and possibly even more emotionally charged, and that's the parental dynamic. I think the through line can very easily boil down to a cycle in which a pretentious, self-absorbed father is stubborn in his relationships to the point of causing divorce. The trauma of this divorce and the trauma of bad parenting then lock his children into a life of being pretentious and getting divorced, traumatizing the next generation of children and perpetuating the cycle. There's also a maternal aspect to this cycle. It's not all the father's fault, but the paternal influence certainly takes precedence in most of these movies. Aspects of this through line pop up in Kicking and Screaming and Mr. Jealousy, namely the idea that divorce and growing up reveal that your parents are real people, and coming to terms with that. But The Squid and the Whale really laid the foundation for this whole through line. Every aspect of the dynamic is there, except for down the line when the cycle repeats, and that's why I thought Marriage Story made the perfect direct sequel, but I honestly think the Meyerowitz stories captures both ends of the spectrum, so these three form a sort of trilogy in my head. The way I like to look at it is that The Squid and the Whale is the root of a tree that branches out in either direction with the most recent two movies, and there are a few ways to define these different routes. For one, Meyerowitz is primarily focused on the traumatic parenting, while divorce is treated as a secondary focus, whereas Marriage Story is the exact opposite, focusing primarily on divorce, while traumatic parenting takes a secondary role. The other focus of these branches is tone, maybe even genre. Just as The Squid and the Whale balances both topics, it balances tone pretty evenly between the comedic and the serious. Then we have Meyerowitz, which is mostly comedic and tongue-in-cheek with moments of surprising emotional weight, and Marriage Story, which is a very emotionally heavy film with moments of surprising comedic relief. Meyerowitz is like a comedy of manners with a lot of irony in the dialogue, and Marriage Story aims to be something a little rawer. So I'm gonna extend this diagram with other movies that seem like ends of a spectrum Baumbach's films are on. On one end, with Meyerowitz, we have the works of Billy Wilder, in which people don't talk like real people, but in the heightened verbal irony we're able to get some genuine commentary. I'll designate The Apartment as the tentpole of this genre. And on the other end of the spectrum, we have the likes of John Cassavetes, which aim to reject superficiality as much as possible, cutting into relationships by simply having two actors duke it out and talk about their feelings. So I think Faces is a fitting tentpole here. As I start to think about the films in these terms, branching out to other filmmakers, I want to go as far as possible, past film even. I've described Wilder's films to be comedies of manners, but if we want to look at the purest example of a comedy of manners, we're gonna have to drop the R and look at Oscar Wilde, namely The Importance of Being Earnest. I'm not gonna spend too much time talking about it, other than the fact that each of these things seems to have stemmed in some part from the next, because as I thought about things in these terms, the same feeling came over me that I was just pointing at stuff and saying, hey, these things are similar, much like pointing out the individual Baumbachisms. But simple observations are the building blocks of revelations, and it was in trying to find a stage equivalent on the other end of the spectrum that I had one. John Cassavetes' whole MO was that Hollywood had failed, and commercial films, even ones he liked, weren't realistic and lacked self-expression. This is the mindset he directed his independent projects with, hoping to bring reflective and deconstructive stories to an industry that was direly lacking it. So naturally, this brought to mind a certain quote from a certain Broadway composer, who said of the next work that Broadway theater has been for many years supported by upper middle class people with upper middle class problems. These people really want to escape that world when they go to the theater. And then here we are, talking about how we're going to bring it right back in their faces, which sounded exactly like Cassavetes' mindset, Broadway being Hollywood. The person who said this was Stephen Sondheim, and the show he was talking about was none other than Company.
You could drive a person crazy. You could drive a person mad.
Of being alive, being alive.
So here I am, worried about pointing at stuff, worried that all I'm saying is this is like that, and that there's no merit to it. But in his own work, Noah Baumbach is explicitly doing the same pointing and making the same connections. Or at least one of them, but they're all connected. Maybe Company isn't as apt an antithesis to The Importance of Being Earnest as Faces is to The Apartment, considering it came out 75 years later, long after the advent of film, even a couple years after Faces, and musical theater still has an inherent artificialness that Cassavetes may not have loved. But I do think the stage comparison is important on either side of the spectrum because it illustrates thematic overlay without cinematic comparison. So from here, it only makes sense to take that cycle of bad parenting and divorce and trauma that we've established as Baumbach's through line and see how it applies to Cassavetes' philosophy. But while I see Cassavetes as someone who is an authority on what he might have called truthful cinema, I feel like my momentum here is sending me down a rabbit hole, and I don't think it would be in my best interest to fight it. So fuck it. We're breaking out Nietzsche, whose writing serves partially to debunk our notion of truth. I don't want to be pedantic, but I also don't want to assume everyone watching this video knows this terminology, so I'm just gonna quickly explain his idea of the Apollonian versus the Dionysian. It was first introduced in his first book, The Birth of Tragedy, which puts it in context of the Greek tragedy. The Apollonian is the dream, and the Dionysian is intoxication. The dream aspect of the Apollonian is the idea that you see images, and these images have a deeper meaning that you have to dissect. The process of a work presenting its ideas via these images, and the act of our interpreting them, is Apollonian. Also key to the Apollonian is the individual, or the act of individuation. Conversely, the intoxication aspect of the Dionysian alludes to Babylonian orgies in which certain stimuli, wine for instance with Dionysus, break down barriers or masks and cause people to come together in an almost barbaric unity. So on one hand, they're opposites, the individual versus the whole, but also in art, Nietzsche defines the Dionysian as the essence of tragedy, essentially. He claims that every tragic Greek hero, from Prometheus to Oedipus, is an Apollonian representation, or a mask, as he also calls it, for the only original tragic hero, Dionysus himself. So while they're opposites, they're also essential parts of a whole. I'm paraphrasing a lot here, and if I elaborate on stuff like the unity of the Apollonian and the Dionysian seeming itself Dionysian, I feel like I would kind of lose track of what I'm getting at here. So I apologize for opening a can of worms and not being as thorough as I maybe should be. Nietzsche eventually takes this concept of unmasking and applies it to the concept of truth in Beyond Good and Evil. In a nutshell, he claims that truth doesn't really exist, and people, namely other philosophers, who claim to be preaching the truth, are really preaching their own perspective, based more on instinct than anything else. He doesn't denounce this idea of false truth, but rather sees utility in it as an individual expression. In other words, he sees the advertised notion of truth as an Apollonian representation for one's Dionysian ideals. And again, I'm really paraphrasing here. There are a lot of contradictions that aren't worth discussing right now, but this whole thought process, I believe, recontextualizes what Cassavetes says about truth. What I particularly love about Nietzsche's language involving unmasking is that one of the essays included in the Cassavetes Criterion box set talks all about moments of unmasking in faces. Critic Stuart Clovins describes moments in which the characters drop all pretense, and not only the tone, but the characters' motivations change. These moments are seen as refusals to continue with the social performance going on, rejections of their own Apollonian representations. Granted, rather than unified, everyone winds up bitter and alone, but the Dionysian is inherently tragic, and it seems so is Cassavetes' notion of truth. Of course, Clovins is talking about unmasking within the text, and Nietzsche's concept of unmasking is more metatextual. In world, Cassavetes may be performing an act of unmasking and revealing the Dionysian beneath the Apollonian, but this entire act, the film itself, is still a representation, and thus an Apollonian mask for Cassavetes' own life, as well as the actors. On the other end of the spectrum, there's one big moment in the apartment that falls under the same unmasking criteria as Clovins lays out, but for the most part, the comedy of manners operates in a way that relies on the mask. It's almost like there's an agreement with the audience that what we're seeing is an Apollonian representation, and while there's a Dionysian core, it's for us to do the unmasking. The importance of being earnest even has embedded references to the fact that it's a play. By that logic, a case could be made that a film with the intentional artifice of the apartment, or earnest for that matter, could be perceived as more truthful than something that tries to do its own unmasking, like Faces, because at least the fake world doesn't pretend to be real. But it could also be argued that breaking the fourth wall like this falls under the same paradox. And this is all, of course, with our altered definition of truth and no real sense of what's actually real. So where does this leave Noah Baumbach? Neither of these films are as far down the spectrum as Faces or The Apartment. Meyerowitz has moments of raw, apparent unmasking, and Marriage Story has characters that seem to be quite Apollonian and detached from our sense of reality. Are his films tragedies then, if they're truly Dionysian? I mean, the description of the Apollonian makes it sound like every story is a tragedy, and I don't really know the answer there. I don't totally understand Nietzsche, but the cycle itself is certainly tragic. That doesn't necessarily make his films tragic, though, because I can't help but note that all of these films end with a sort of rejection of tragedy. Walt leaves his abusive father in the hospital, Danny leaves his abusive father with his nurse to go and see Matthew, who's now working to solve the issues in his marriage, and Charlie and Nicole remain friends, even preserving on some level their love for each other despite all the nastiness. Each film presents a tragedy in Noah Baumbach's life, and we see him actively working to break the cycle. My original idea of Marriage Story being a sequel to The Squid and the Whale, of course, has the element of Walt rejecting his father in an uplifting way, only to fall down a similar path years later, which would prove the rejection of tragedy to be futile, but I think that would oversimplify what the extent of the tragedy is. While Charlie falls into certain behaviors likened to his father, it's established from the start that he's taking active measures to break the cycle and not be like him, and in the end, they don't let the divorce consume the family unit, allowing them to still provide Henry with a healthy upbringing, hopefully preventing him from falling into the cycle, thus stopping it altogether. Whether or not they've already done irreversible damage is unclear, but it's that active pursuit that keeps them afloat, I think. For this reason, I think it's important to look at Baumbach's collaborations with his spouses. Margot at the Wedding stars Jennifer Jason Leigh, and Greenberg was co-written by her. While these don't adhere to the through line as strictly as the three I've been discussing, there are still strong aspects of the cycle present here. These are both comparatively pretty tense and melodramatic films, which eventually led to tense relations and a divorce between Leigh and Baumbach. For this reason, it's really cathartic to watch his collaborations with Greta Gerwig, as both films seem interested in subjects completely outside of the cycle, going so far as to be shot on a different medium than his other films. Even Mistress America, in which divorce serves an important plot function, is thematically focused on totally separate things. In this sense, Baumbach is breaking his own cycle by making films not about the cycle. These two films sandwich While We're Young, for which Gerwig wasn't involved but stands out because it's Baumbach's only film with source material, as minimal as it may be. But this film also seems to be thematically focused elsewhere without Gerwig's influence. A friend of mine who attended a Q&A told me that Baumbach considers The Squid and the Whale to be his second first film and Frances Ha to be his third first film. I think this makes sense, as The Squid and the Whale is the film that laid that foundation, and Frances Ha was the first of this new wave of films, proving to himself that he wasn't stuck in that cycle. And it was after successfully breaking out of it that he was able to return to it more cleverly, maturely, and objectively than before, while still preserving the inherent subjectivity of filmmaking. I think that's what I was trying to get at with my first attempts. I don't know why I wasn't able to frame it in a way that made any sort of sense and didn't get bogged down by discussions of like 4 other filmmakers. Not that this rendition was any more focused. But that's where I'm at. That's the video. You have it now. And I'll be making more again. Links to my social media and Patreon are in the description. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.